Welcome to episode number 2 of the Ag Comm Network podcast. Holly, they've let us come back for a second episode. I'm glad Facebook allowed us to come right back on in. And we have a very interesting show today. I'm really looking forward to it. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Kelsey Litchfield. I'm with the University of Illinois College of Aces. And I also have Holly Spangler with me from Farm Progress. Hello, Holly.
Hello, Kelsey.
And our guest today is Chris Clayton from DTN, the Progressive Farmer. And Chris, you are the Ag Policy Editor, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So the way this is going to work today, we're going to go ahead and fire off some questions for you, and then people can jump on, and ask their own questions that they may have for you. And Holly and I will help facilitate that. So we'll go ahead and get started. Chris, if you just want to go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us more about you and your background in agriculture and journalism.
Well, I'm live here from DTN World News headquarters in Omaha. I graduated from the University of Missouri in 93, and I've been a journalist ever since. I bounced around from newspapers in Missouri, Illinois, Kansas, until I ended up at the Omaha World Herald back exactly 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I mainly covered Iowa. I was interested in working for the World Herald to cover things like the Iowa caucuses and stuff like that. But I did a little bit of everything in terms of news coverage, whether it was criminal cases or whatever. And then around mid 2001, I accidentally came across a large cattle fraud case, just purely by accident. But I ended up breaking this story, and I didn't really know anything about the cattle feeding business at the time. So ended up delving deeply into that. There were literally like a couple $100 million lost in this case. It kind of got swept under a little bit because it happened just before 9/11. But this case really took about 2 years to finally come to a head. And so they couldn't deal with the bankruptcy on it because the criminal case was so complicated. But the bankruptcy lawyers couldn't understand what these guys had done in this Ponzi scheme until they actually went ahead and confessed and explained how it all happened and what they did. But at the end of the day, I ended up doing a lot of cattle, livestock stories, and then within maybe 18 months, the first BSE case happened. Next thing I know, basically, I'm the ag writer for the World Herald. So I just kind of fall into this livestock situation, and next thing I know, I'm the guy who is our main ag writer. And I didn't even know DTN was based here. Didn't know much of anything about it. I focused mainly on what other newspapers were doing. But I met Urban Lehner, who was the editor-in-chief of DTN at the time, and we started getting along really well. And, over time, I liked the idea of moving to some place where I wasn't competing with sports coverage, basically. The daily newspapers now are really dominated by sports. The Omaha World Herald, the Lincoln Journal-Star, they live and die by the Nebraska Cornhuskers. So everything else, though, is second to that. If you want to travel, we can't travel, spend money because we got to send 18 guys to the bowl game. All of that kind of stuff, and that gets old after a while. So I finally went ahead and moved to DTN, where we don't have sports coverage, and I don't have to worry about whether we're going to be on the front because the Huskers won a big game or whatever, right? So So that kind of changed my career pretty dramatically around 2005, and I started to spend a lot more time going out to Washington and following policy issues out there. And what I learned over time was that pretty much every situation that comes down the pike in some way, shape, or form has a connection to agriculture. It really doesn't matter what's going on in D.C. There's a tie. Today the big story is these tariffs on steel and aluminum, and all of the reaction from all the other countries is to slap tariffs on our agriculture exports. So, everything that happens in some way, shape, or form, you can draw back to something related to agriculture that affects our readers in some way.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
It's kind of the long and short of it there. So.
And I think for you talk about your story and how you just kept on just learning about the next thing, and you gradually kind of not stumbled into things, but you learned about other different topics, and you had a genuine interest to learn about those topics. And I think that's one of the main things that makes a journalist is you have and you want to learn about a certain topic. Would you agree?
Yeah, there has to be a natural curiosity and desire to really look at something a little bit differently. And you also have to break your own perceptions. I think probably my perception in coming out of college in my mid-20s, the idea of covering agriculture is like, what? I don't want to really write the fact, hey, they planted corn, B, they harvested corn, and what do you do for the next 6 months of the year? That was just not something I was interested in doing. But over time, you also began to see some of the other work that people did in covering agriculture, and you learn all of the different issues that you can touch upon, whether it's environment or trade, certainly politics, etc. Being in the Midwest, growing up in the Midwest, I came out of school in the mid 80s, right in the middle of the farm crisis and right before really the drought in the late 80s. So the small towns that I grew up in and around were pretty economically depressed, and they still are, in a lot of ways. But they live and die by agriculture, and so you understand now as somebody who lives in the Midwest or Plains, how much our economy really demands that things do go well out in rural America, or it impacts everybody in Des Moines, Kansas City, Omaha. They may not realize it, but there is a huge connection there.
Yeah. You were talking. Oh, go ahead, Holly.
Oh, I was just thinking about the Farm Bill coverage that you do a lot of, Chris. You've covered several Farm Bills now. What do you see happening this time around, that stands out to you or is different from the past, or, and how has your coverage maybe differed this time?
What has changed over time is that the Farm Bill has become a lot more of a partisan tool than it used to be. It used to be regional fights. The Democrats and the Republicans from Iowa, Nebraska, the Midwest, whatever, would have more regional disputes with Southerners about farm programs, and that was the huge battle. Was Southerners versus Northerners and Midwesterners on farm programs. Now it's much more Republican versus Democrat over SNAP program, the food aid programs and things of that nature, and the actual farm programs themselves. I haven't really been talked about that much. There are only so many times you can write the same story. Hey, got to protect crop insurance, and over and over. I was listening to a forum just yesterday out of Kansas, and that was all that was focused on there. Just protect the crop insurance program. So it's different purely because it's a much more partisan situation now than it used to be. And you see that in the Farm Bill just basically got sucked up into everything else that goes on in D.C. You have to be on the right or the left side of a situation. And if you're in the middle, you better pick a side, basically.
Sure.
So it's a little more difficult at the moment. I'm not really dropping everything to go out to DC to cover what might be happening with the Senate bills, that sort of thing. This time around, I'll monitor a little more from the off of the internet and approach things a little bit that way. But I'm trying to take an approach too of maybe just finding a few more feature pieces related to Farm Bill topics that will allow me to get out in the country a little bit more rather than just DC and Omaha.
Sure. And so if the debate is now between Republicans and Democrats rather than Midwest versus the South, how is that impacting, the actual debate about the Farm Bill portion, that our readers would be interested in? How is that affecting that debate? And are those issues getting discussed the way, you think they might need to be?
Well, in the House, they really didn't get discussed very much. There's a huge issue maybe with what to do with the commodity safety net and how much it should be changed. One problem, is that there isn't a lot of money. So that's a problem. Can't really make a lot of changes if there isn't a lot of money. But some of the other issues that have not been discussed so much is we know that there's a huge water quality problem out in the Midwest, particularly the upper Midwest. Yeah. Well, they're looking to cut conservation over basically about $800 million over the stretch of the Farm Bill, get rid of the main program that deals with working lands, the CSP, and roll a little bit more money into the EQIP program. But there are no innovative solutions being offered to expand conservation in different ways. There's no discussion happening in that realm. What can you do to increase more private participation and investment in conservation, for instance? Because the water quality problems don't go away on their own. You're going to risk the situation. Everybody, hey, we don't have WOTUS anymore, so everybody thinks water quality regulatory issues are out the door. Don't have to worry about them. They don't go away. More cities are going to get a little more annoyed, like Des Moines has done. There are going to be more situations come up where somebody's going to eventually sue and say, that pipe that comes out of the end of a tile is a point source. There's a hole there. We can see it. That should be deemed a point source. It's the risk, I think, that comes down the line when you just say, we don't have to worry about that anymore. We're just going to take a little bit more money away from conservation. Well, what's the loss? And very few people having that conversation. So those kind of things, I think, are being lost because of the lack of creativity, I would say, in this Farm Bill discussion, lack of vision. It's just, let's extend out most of everything that's out there right now. We'll make a few cuts here. We'll get a big fight going over food aid issues, and we'll just let the ag economy roll on as it is.
Yeah. One of the things when talking about these topics, what I think of is building trust with not only your audience, but with your sources. And Chris, as you talk about these topics with the Farm Bill and your coverage through DTN, how do you build relationships with those that you are reporting on, such as when you're talking about the water quality and things like that? You have great knowledge of it, but how do you build those relationships with your sources in order to get the right information out?
It's very important to be honest and upfront and not ignore a problem. I think the best journalists don't just glaze everything over with a with a lot of icing and sweetness, but you're honest and direct. Mm-hmm. I view myself, I've gotten into some headbutting with different people over issues such as climate change or water quality stories, things of that nature that maybe I'm not, quote, presenting ag in the best light or whatever. My point back is I am the friend that tells you got to turn the keys over. The friend that's honest with you, say, hey, you can't treat her that way. You got to be more respectful. The friend that says, if you don't keep going to class, you're going to flunk out. Sometimes your friends are the ones that have to be the most honest with you, and that's like basically the way I approach my job. I got a little bit of pushback and criticism last week on Twitter from some guys who don't want to hear that. The House version of the Farm Bill doesn't make any changes to means testing for farmers or the volume of commodity, the safety net that you can receive. So, you can basically be a millionaire and still collect farm program payments. You don't have to work on the farm and collect farm program payments. I can go sign, if the House Farm Bill goes through the way it is, I can go sign up with my cousin and say that I'm providing management assistance and I can receive farm program payments. That sounds really good to give hey, want to sign up your cousin, you want to don't worry about payment caps or anything like that. That comes back to bite down the line when 2 or 3 years from now, EWG goes, hey, look at all these people in New York who are suddenly making millions off of farm programs. And then it comes back to bite you in the next farm bill because they get a lot tighter. And somebody has to be the one to point out, is it really okay to make all the SNAP people work 20 hours a week, but say that, Uncle Bill or Cousin Billy going to college full time can collect $125,000 a year in ARC payments? Does that really jibe well? It certainly doesn't jibe well with average taxpayers. I can, my family down in Missouri, none of whom are directly in agriculture, are among those who cuss the big payments to the largest farmers in their community, because they've seen the consolidation that's happened just where we live, where we used to have a bunch of farmers in the area. Now we have 5, and they've become very angry about the safety net because of that.
And yet it feels like those conversations,
short, basically.
Sure. It feels like those conversations aren't happening, though, as we're fighting about SNAP and fighting between Republican and Democrats. Like the real meat of what we could be fixing doesn't get talked about.
I think you'll see that a little bit more in the Senate, certainly because Senator Grassley will be raising some of these issues as well when it comes to farm program safety net. He'll be bringing up some of these topics, and I think the senators are much more keen and aware to this stuff than what we saw in the House, what's going on in the House bill.
Sure. Chris, I'm curious, we haven't talked about, trade and all of that much, and you cover a lot of that as well. And I'm curious, you mentioned Twitter. How are you using Twitter in your coverage of trade and thinking about some of the information that the president's sharing, about the decisions he's making? How are you using Twitter in some of those conversations and following that trade war situation?
Well, it's depending on who you're following and how many people you're following, Twitter can basically function as a news wire. I mean, just this morning, as I'm following all of this stuff that's going down, I see AP news flash on Twitter that Mexico is going to retaliate against, products like pork bellies and grapes were a couple that were mentioned. So you use Twitter a lot of times as a news feed, basically, to see what exactly, because it's hard. Nobody can keep track of it all, and we're not Reuters or Bloomberg. We don't have hundreds of reporters around the world. So the ability to just kind of keep track of the flow of conversation that is happening on any given topic, whether it is the tariffs or Farm Bill, or noticing that you're suddenly seeing a bunch of images about drought in the southern plains or fires. So from that side of things, it's literally like just following and seeing what is happening out there, what's the main messages coming out, and then taking our articles and resending them out. It's difficult in one sense because a byline used to be pretty anonymous. Nobody in the world knew who Chris Clayton was. Now you are on social media. They understand your personality. Whether you're sarcastic, as I like to be from time to time, daily, or your sports fans. So it does allow you to show that one thing, you're a human being. You click on and you like the puppy pictures on Twitter or whatever. And secondly, it allows you to really see everything that is kind of going on out there in the world that is suddenly picking up a lot of traction.
Sure.
I tell people a lot that I think of Twitter as a coffee shop. You're there to have conversations with people, interact with people. And then from a communicator journalist standpoint, I see it's important to be on there to share news like we talked about, but also while you're at live events, being that representative for people that can't be there. And Chris, I guess my question is, why is it important for people to be engaged, not only on Twitter, but on social media as journalists, and interacting with those that not only are journalists as well, but being a voice for others that can't be at a certain live event, or example, they can't be in Washington, D.C., but they want to know what's going on. Why is it important to have that presence?
Well, it's just the new medium of what we do now, and we've changed with the technology. Back when I long time ago now, it seems, graduated college, you didn't even have the ability to share information from an event at all. Your editors, nobody knew what was going on. You would go out and cover a car accident or a crime or something like that. And at the very beginning, we didn't even have a cell phone to communicate and call back and say, we need a photographer here.
Yeah.
Over time, we changed and we adapted with the phone technology and was able to, from the very beginning, call back to the newsroom and ask for help or transcribe a story or something like that. Now you basically are able to do that online and go blow by blow of a particular event, or a comment that is poignant, or a video that is certainly newsworthy. All of these things are just the changing dynamics of news. And if you are, I can't think of what I'm doing of following a news other than maybe the smallest local paper anymore that doesn't have some sort of social media presence.
Yeah.
I do see that, the local paper where I live doesn't do that. At the same time, there is a kid in my kid's high school who does blow by blow on Facebook all of the sporting events. So I'm not reading the local paper anymore. I'm watching this kid's Twitter feed and Facebook post online if our local high school is out playing a game somewhere, or whatever, because this kid is actually doing a better job of providing something instantaneously than the local paper is. And so he's doing the job that the local paper used to, we used to have the local paper for. Mm-hmm. So it's just the evolving way that the media has adapted over time.
I can only imagine what's going to happen in even 5 years, how much technology is going to change. And I feel like as journalists, we have to continue to evolve, or we will miss the mark in serving our audiences.
Sure.
It does, though, create a different kind of level of stress. It used to be you shut the laptop off, you went home, and you did not think about work at the end of after that. Now something is happening at 8:30, 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, and I'm posting a blog or something, or I'm sending out tweets on it, or different things happening. So it as a journalist, it changes your life and work patterns a little bit, because everything is now 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Something happened in the Chinese ministry, whatever, comes out at 4 o'clock our time on Sunday, and does something. You feel like you're obligated to react, because you don't want to be sitting around until the next day and leaving your readership behind.
I feel like I've read or heard somewhere where, like, the New York Times has, they've totally changed, and other major papers have changed their staffing hours around the president's tweets. There's a team of editors ready to go, 4:30 in the morning before he's tweeting, so they can report on whatever might come out of that, and then their day ends sooner, but, theoretically, but they've changed their staffing just to meet that exact need.
But we also have these risks now, because people post things and you see them and you're immediately shocked or surprised, or it catches you emotionally and you want to go ahead and send it out, and then you find out after the fact that that photo actually did not go with this situation or whatever. And so sometimes our own desire to be right there and be responsive, and then you find out, this was fake, or or just erroneous, whatever it was, and so you have to be a lot more leery in some sense of knowing that the information that you're getting is credible.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Chris, I'm curious, how often are you going out to DC, or how often are you sitting in, any lawmaker's office, or meeting with, staffers, that kind of thing? Like, how do you manage that part of the job, and relative to, like, how much are you doing on the phone, I guess? Mm-hmm.
I'm probably doing a little less direct travel right at the moment. We go out, we go out at least once a month to Washington for the WASDE, the supply and demand estimates. And that's the focus of that trip, but I will build in the whole week. Generally, I'll go out there ahead of the crop report, or I will stay on extended time after the crop report, and do that mainly to pick up other things, whether it's going to congressional hearings, other events that are going on in town, or maybe I've got some interviews lined up with some specific lawmakers or others involved. I'm not generally sitting around. I take every now and then I will make the point of specifically reaching out to a particular lawmaker when I'm out there to try to get a sit-down interview. A lot of times in D.C., though, you're literally grabbing guys as they're coming off the floor after a vote. There's an area called the Speakers Lounge in the House, and you know that when they're all in there doing a series of votes, you can pass somebody a note that gets handed to a lawmaker, and he gets pulled off the floor, and you talk to him or her for a few minutes. Kind of the same with the Senate. You're walking into the Senate hallway. I was literally standing there about a month ago. It was during the middle of that whole situation. I take that back with the Section 199 tax situation. And here comes Senator Thune walking down, and next thing I know, you see these videos all the time of the reporter walking with the senator or whatever, and that's just basically, half the time you're asking them questions while you're walking with them to the elevator or whatever. So it's those kind of catching people, or you find that they're going to be speaking at a particular event, and you make the point of going to that event to hear them speak and ask them a few questions afterwards, that sort of thing. It's all over the place, basically. But what I generally know when I go out there is that I doubt on a daily basis that there's going to be something that I won't have anything to do. I'm always going to have something I can do. I do make the point of going to the commodity and the general farm organizations. Hey, I'm going to be in town. Can you visit about this or whatever? Or if there's a particular issue that's hot at the moment, trying to track down some people who are experts in that area.
Sure.
Gotta know the subway system in DC. So you really need to know that. So
I've never been on a subway in my life, so I'm terrified. Probably for the first time when I have to go on a subway, I'll need a guide. That's for sure.
You're not that far from Chicago, right? I mean, it's.
Yeah, I just prefer to walk around. I like to walk. I think I've watched too many Law and Order SVU episodes.
You got to be careful though when you walk too much. One time, when Joe Hans was Ag Secretary, I was at the Capitol, and I just decided I would walk down to USDA for his event from him. And by the time I got down there, I'm a sports jacket on. I was literally just drenched in sweat, basically. And the whole time he's talking and everything, I could not stop perspiring. And I was like, that was a really, really dumb idea just to walk from the Capitol down to USDA. I'm a very healthy guy. I can do this. No, that was a bad idea. So
yeah, that's a lot farther than people might think.
You can eyeball it and go, oh, no, it's not that far. But, when you're walking it with a backpack, you realize in July that's not a smart thing to do.
Oh. Right. In the DC heat. Yeah.
Nowadays, you can just not only get a taxi, but you can get on your phone. We've been talking about technology and just order a Lyft or an Uber.
Yeah, it makes it very easy.
Yeah, that's for sure. Chris, I have one more question for me. And personally, as a young journalist, I'm only 23 years old. What's your biggest piece of advice, I guess, to not only my generation, but maybe journalists in general? What's your biggest piece of advice for us?
You should always be writing and filing. I always view daily journalism literally like a baseball season. You got to get up and take your swings at the bat every single day, basically. Mm-hmm. There are the people, there's the idea that, if you're working on a long project, you got to stop everything. Well, you can work on a project while you're dealing with everything else. You can view it there are a ton of analogies basically, but in daily journalism, you got to feed the beast. So you have to write basically every day. Mm-hmm. And you have to you do have to, you use your own curiosity to work on articles. If you're curious about something, surely there are readers curious about the same thing. I've written a couple of blockchain pieces over the last several months because up until, back at the beginning of the year, there was very little discussion about it. And then suddenly it became this thing everybody was talking about at different meetings. So I became very, very curious about, well, what's this mean for the average farmer, sort of thing. But that too is, there was an old Birmingham news editor named Clark Stallworth, Birmingham, Alabama. And so I went to journalism school for 4 years, and then I went in Illinois and working for the Quincy Herald Whig, which was the worst 9 months of my life, by the way. But anyway, I went to this event that this guy Clark Stallworth was doing, and I always remember he just said, I'm paying you 50 cents a day for your newspaper. He says, when you write something, the very beginning always should begin with, what does this mean to the reader? And that always should be the mindset when you're writing something is, what does it mean to the people you're writing? It doesn't mean that the city council voted to raise the tax levy. It means your property taxes are going to go up $10 per, $100,000 or whatever. You have to write it more towards the perspective of your readership. And,
sure.
And that's always something to keep in mind as well.
Chris, do you have a particular time of day when you like to write?
I like to do more editing and writing in the morning.
Same.
I've got coffee sitting right next to me. I got NPR in the background listening, and I like to get stuff out like that. I feel like that the day has been productive if I've got something that I'm filing early in the morning. Yeah. But I used to like to write a lot more at night, but I think as I've gotten older, I don't really like to do it as much. But if I'm on a topic that I'm really interested in, it really doesn't matter the time of day. But generally, I do find that I like to be productive early in the morning.
Yeah, I agree. I saw Samantha commented on the video asking, we must think alike, because she asked the best piece of advice for new journalists and entering the industry, and we were thinking the same. So thank you, Samantha, for your question. And we covered that earlier, but for this broadcast, and thanks, Chris, so much for coming on and chatting with us. I think it's a lot to learn about ag policy specifically. Before we went live, Chris and I were talking about how I have a bit of interest in ag policy. And I think just being a journalist and kind of the whole theme of this conversation and the theme of this podcast, like Holly and I talked about the first episode, is just to keep learning and being with learning from others, and along with this podcast is just keep learning, and you'll learn along the way, and you'll make mistakes and things like that. Chris, you talked about your experiences with some of the other newspapers, and I think as a young journalist, just realizing that there's going to be humps in the road, but you're going to ultimately find your passion of what you would like to cover. So, for sure.
Hey, and I was just thinking, and I think Samantha and I are like Samantha, and we're all thinking the same thing today, but I was going to ask the same question that she just popped up with. Chris, do you have a favorite podcast? Like, is there something you really like to listen to?
Podcast, not so much. I've got some that I download and listen to on the that I have on the phone, but I don't really listen to them as much. I like the ones on oddly enough on. I like to listen to podcasts on space and physics. Mm-hmm. Just trying to learn something that I really don't understand very much about. What's his name? Tyson.
Neil. Is it deGrasse?
deGrasse, yes. So I've listened to him a few times. The problem is if I'm in a car, I prefer to crank up something really loud from the 1980s, music-wise, or generally I will just NPR if I'm listening to the news. So much more into the daily news, but or really loud music. So it's a little strange seeing a guy driving a pickup truck, driving through Omaha, listening to "Come On Eileen," but that's kind of the way I do it. So
I'm with you. I like to tell people my father raised me right, because I know there's country and stuff out there, but I grew up listening to classic rock, 1980s, 70s. I love it. So we'll be good friends. Chris, kind of wrapping it up, how can people follow you? You mentioned Twitter. What's your handle, and how can people connect with you?
My Twitter handle is Chris Clayton DTN, and I'm on Twitter all the time. So I do get a lot of messages from people. I've got a message this morning from another journalist asking me about drought, for instance, because they had some questions, and I referred to a meteorologist on our staff. So I'm always on Twitter quite a bit. That's probably one of the easiest way to connect with me in some way. Perfect.
Well, thank you, Chris. This conversation has gone by really fast, about 40 minutes. That's crazy. But thank you so much to Chris Clayton at DTN, the Progressive Farmer, for coming on the podcast and talking to us about his coverage with ag policy and things like that. Holly, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, this has been great. We appreciate it, Chris. I think, some of us in ag journalism are generalists. We cover a lot of, a little bit of everything. And I think it's always interesting to talk to somebody like you who really, you specialize in a beat, and you know it inside and out. So we appreciate your insight there.
Well, thanks for having me. So this podcast, where do we see it? How do you connect to watching it?
Yeah. So after this live stream is over, I will take the audio and I'll download, and then we are on iTunes and SoundCloud. So probably I'd say by early tomorrow morning we'll have that uploaded. So
what do you follow it on? What's the name of it?
The Ag Comm Network podcast.
Ag Comm Network podcast.
Yep. So if you search that in iTunes or SoundCloud, or if you probably just Google it, you can also go to the AEA website, agcommnetwork.com, I believe. Mm-hmm. And we have I'm not sure what tab it's under, but they also list the podcast on our website as well.
Sure.
Okay.
And every AEA member will get an email tomorrow with their byline for the week that'll have a link to it as well.
Yep.
Okay, great.
So, well, thank you, Chris. Thanks, Holly. And thank you to all of our viewers who watched this video. Stay tuned for details on our next episode. But thank you, Chris, for coming on and talking to us today.
Thanks for having me, guys. Hope it was useful.
Yeah.
You bet. Thanks, Chris.
If you guys want to go ahead and stay on, I'll go ahead and end the broadcast. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.